The rain was coming down hard on the city tonight, each drop hitting the pavement like spent brass casings from yesterday's battles. April 22nd, 2026, and the streets were slick with more than just water. They were slick with digital blood. I'm Jack Cipher, and I've been working these cyber streets long enough to know when the night's going to be heavy. 4 cases landed on my desk tonight, and every single one of them was a repeat offender. Known exploited vulnerabilities, the kind that keep coming back like a bad penny, the kind that never learned to stay down. The first case that caught my eye was a break-in from 2023, CVE 2023-23752, they called it. CVSS score of 5.3, medium severity, but the informants were singing loud about this one. EPSS probability sitting at 95%, nearly certain this perp would strike again. The crime scene was Joomla, versions 4.0.0 through 4.2.7. What we had here was a classic case of improper access control falling under CVE-2017-1000353. The vulnerability lived in Joomla's web service endpoints, those API gateways that handle requests from the outside world. An attacker could craft specific HTTP requests to these endpoints without proper authentication, bypassing the access checks that should have been standing guard like bouncers at a speakeasy door. The system would process these unauthorized requests as if they came from a legitimate user, handing over sensitive information like configuration details, user data, and system internals. Joomla powers millions of websites across the globe, from small business storefronts to enterprise content management systems. When this vulnerability gets exploited, attackers gain unauthorized read access to web service data that should be locked away tight. In the real world, this means reconnaissance for larger attacks, data harvesting for identity theft operations, or intelligence gathering for targeted ransomware campaigns. The beauty of this particular flaw was that it required no authentication and no user interaction. Just point, shoot, and walk away with the goods. The fix was straightforward enough. Upgrade to Joomla 4.2.8 or later, where the development team patched the access control mechanisms. System administrators needed to check their Joomla installations immediately and apply the update. For detection, security teams should monitor their web access logs for unusual API endpoint requests, particularly those targeting web service URLs without proper authentication headers. But that wasn't the only body on the slab tonight. The next case was a real heavyweight, a double murder from 2017 that refused to stay buried. CVE 2017-1000353, CVSS score of 9.8, critical severity, EPSS probability at 94%. This one had Jenkins written all over it, versions 2.56 and earlier, plus the LTS branch 2.46.1 and earlier. This was a Java deserialization vulnerability, textbook CVE-502. The technical mechanism was brutal in its simplicity. Jenkins exposed a CLI remoting endpoint that accepted serialized Java objects over TCP port 47278 without proper validation. An attacker could craft a malicious serialized object containing arbitrary code, send it to this endpoint, and watch as Jenkins dutifully deserialized the object and executed the embedded payload. No authentication required, no user interaction needed, just raw, unauthenticated remote code execution served up on a silver platter. Jenkins is the backbone of continuous integration and deployment pipelines across the software development world. Hundreds of thousands of instances handle the build and deployment processes for everything from startups to Fortune 500 companies. When this vulnerability gets exploited, attackers gain complete system control over the Jenkins server, often running with elevated privileges. In practice, this means initial access for ransomware operations, supply chain compromise through malicious code injection into build processes, or lateral movement into connected development and production environments. The remediation path was clear. Upgrade Jenkins to version 2.57 or later, or 2.46.2 LTS or later, where the deserialization vulnerability was patched. DevOps and build engineering teams needed to prioritize this immediately. As a workaround, administrators could disable the CLI remoting functionality entirely if it wasn't actively used, or restrict network access to port 47278. Detection required monitoring for unexpected connections to the CLI port and unusual Java process behavior on Jenkins servers. I barely had time to light another cigarette when the next file landed on my desk. CVE 2018-7600 rounded out the evening's entertainment. Another critical, another 9.8 CVSS score, another 94% EPSS probability. This one had Drupal's fingerprints all over it, affecting versions before 7.58, 8.x before 8.3.9, 8.4.x before 8.4.6, and 8.5.x before 8.5.1. The vulnerability was a form validation bypass, a cousin of CVE-20 improper input validation. The flaw lived in Drupal's form API, which handles user input processing across the content management system. Attackers could craft malicious form submissions with specially structured array elements that bypass Drupal's input sanitization mechanisms. When the system processed these forms, the unsanitized input would be passed to dangerous functions like eval or system calls, resulting in arbitrary code execution on the web server. Drupal powers millions of websites worldwide, including government agencies, universities, and major media organizations. This vulnerability became known as Drupalgeddon for good reason. Successful exploitation grants attackers complete control over the web server, often with the privileges of the web server process. Real-world attacks typically involve web shell deployment for persistent access, database compromise for data theft, or server compromise as a launching point for broader network infiltration. The patch was available in the specified updated versions, and site administrators needed to apply updates immediately. Web application firewalls could provide temporary protection by filtering malicious form submissions, but patching remained the only permanent solution. Security teams should monitor for web shells, unusual file modifications, and suspicious database activity on Drupal installations. The night was winding down, but the message was crystal clear. These weren't just old vulnerabilities gathering dust in some archive. These were active threats, repeat offenders caught in the act by CISA's known exploited vulnerabilities catalog. Each one represented thousands of potential victims still running vulnerable software, still exposed to the same attacks that worked years ago. In this business, the past has a way of catching up with you. Tonight's cases were proof that in cybersecurity, yesterday's crimes become tomorrow's headlines if you don't stay vigilant. This is Jack Cipher reminding you that in the digital underworld, the only thing worse than a new threat is an old one you forgot to patch.